Underground bases, secret government conspiracies, aliens walking among us, and a firefight between U.S. military personnel and extraterrestrial beings. Today's discussion will focus on the testimony of a man named Phil Schneider and the bombshell claims he made that still resonate through the UFO community today. My name is Aaron Deese, and with me once again are Ron Murphy, Heather Mosier, Katie Page, Micah Hanks, and Mark Matsky. Today we're talking about a man named Phil Schneider and the claims he made that, as we've said, are still hotly discussed and debated to this day. This story doesn't really start with Mr. Schneider. It actually starts a little bit earlier with a man named Paul Benowitz, who allegedly intercepted radio signals coming from a government base near the town of Dulce, New Mexico.
Well, that brings in Richard Doty right away. Richard Doty, a disinformation officer, came in 1977. And he's a player in this case for sure, and took this line of Paul Benowitz and what he was observing out there around the Dulce base. And basically, in a nutshell, Paul Benowitz lost his mind.
Paul Benowitz is both one of those most intriguing cases in ufology and also one of those tragic cases. Here we had a researcher who, back in the 1980s, had been highly influential in multiple ways. He was a respected physicist, he was a pilot, he was quite the theorist with regard to UFOs, but he also had technology on his side, and he began to make these intriguing detections around Kirtland Air Force Base. And being a good American, Paul Benowitz goes to Kirtland and he says, listen, I'd like to share some information about what I've found here. Enter Richard Doty and others with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations who say, well, what do we do? He's picking up on some actual experiments that we're doing here at Kirtland. Do we tell him, listen, keep your mouth shut, don't talk about this, this is some national security stuff? Or do we encourage his seeming belief that these things are related to UFOs? Well, they chose the latter. So Paul Benowitz was essentially told, listen, report to us on what you're finding. And this helped to facilitate a belief in some things that I think it's fair to say Paul Benowitz was making determinations of his own, and he believed, but those beliefs were encouraged, particularly by Special Agent Richard Doty, who's come forward and over the years has spoken at length about his involvement with providing disinformation to Paul Benowitz. But I think that what's also important about this as it relates to the idea of the whole Dulce enigma is that at least as early as 1979 or 1980, Paul Benowitz also is probably the first person who, in any kind of documentation, provides us with references to underground bases in that area and the idea that there's some sort of an ET involvement with this. Now, he may not have been the first person, and certainly wasn't, to have embellished that story and to made it the so-called Dulce War story that we know today, but he was one of the earliest people to, in writing, convey these ideas that I think kind of plant the seeds for things that were later to come.
Well, let's talk about the narrative of what Benowitz believed he had uncovered and what Phil Schneider would later allege to be fact. The narrative goes that Phil was a government contractor hired by the government to work on underground bases near the town of Dulce in 1979. He notes that during the setup process of this construction project that there are a lot of armed U.S. military personnel stationed amongst the workers. And at one point, one of the heavy drills that they're using to, extract the earth and build this underground base breaks down several times in the same area. After a while, black smoke starts coming out of this hole in the ground, and this is when Schneider alleges that he actually went down in some sort of lift into this underground shaft to investigate with a green beret. He's very specific in saying it was a green beret. What happened next is where things get really crazy, to use that term lightly.
So then as Schneider, according to his story, arrives at this level where apparently the smoke is coming from, he sees something rather frightening. There are a group of aliens there, and they open fire. He draws his weapon. Now, it's kind of unclear why Schneider would have been armed, again, as a government geologist under these circumstances. The Green Beret we can understand, but Schneider said he was carrying a firearm, I believe, as well. And he says that he's basically shredded. He, according to the story, is shot. He loses fingers. I think they injure him in his torso as well. And this is the kind of firefight that occurs. And for years afterward, as Schneider goes on the lecture circuit and begins telling his story, I mean, he is clearly able to display injuries that he has, seemingly indicative of there having been some kind of physical altercation, which was very compelling for people at the time. And again, he probably became, I would say, a focal point of the whole Dulce war enigma, the idea that there had been some sort of an underground base. At some point, humans lost control of this. It's completely being used by extraterrestrials, and their intentions are not very good, and there have been human casualties. And if anything, really, Schneider, according to his story, was lucky. He escaped. Others not so much.
Schneider alleges at this event that 66 servicemen lost their lives in the ensuing battle, and kind of implies that some form of cover-up was put into play to essentially erase these people. How you can erase 66 people is beyond me, but that may be a question for another day. And something you touched on a moment ago, Micah, he mentions that he was able to take out 2 of these beings with his own weapon, which, as a fan of science fiction, I don't think I'm alone in that at this table. To me, that slaps of a science fiction story. An ordinary guy who, for some reason, has a weapon is plunged into this situation beyond his control. Very much kind of a Joseph Campbell hero's journey type of progression. And he's able to do this miraculous, heroic thing. If you put me in that situation, I don't think I would have been able to take out 2 aliens who were apparently armed with some kind of energy weapon, which resulted in Phil's injuries that we'll talk about here in a moment. But it very much has these sort of beats and these points that look like a fictional narrative at the surface. I'm not saying that's what it is.
That's interesting. There's even a heroic sacrifice, right? Because the Marine shoves him back on the lift, and he's taken to safety, and that he was supposed to have lost his life in a battle then.
And that's a trope of science fiction. That's a trope of many fictional narratives, but, Dune, one of the first major science fiction novels ever published, which came out shortly before this would have occurred, includes a scene where one of the heroes, pushes the protagonist through a door, shutting it behind him and taking on the invading alien force to make this heroic sacrifice. So it's difficult not to draw fictional parallels just given the narrative.
And the untrained geologist was able to defeat, to live, while these trained individuals were not, right? And he ascends to safety. There's a whole bunch of allegories into this kind of thing.
On this whole idea, he describes these creatures as being armed with what we would probably describe as directed energy weapons. And as Mr. Schneider was making his rounds through the UFO circuits, giving speeches and talking at conventions and things, one of the pieces of evidence he would display was, he had some missing fingers, he had some pretty grisly looking chest wounds. I would like to talk about that a little bit, because I do think I know at least for me, when I'm thinking about this case, that's one of the things that comes to mind. Where do these injuries come from if they are not a result of this story?
Well, I heard, and I don't know if it's true, that there was somebody who said that he actually acquired these injuries from a shop incident, and he had them prior to the Dulce battle. So that's what I have heard.
Yeah, my understanding also is that there have been multiple sources who have said that they had known Schneider to have had the injuries before the claims start to come out. And really, there's so much to unpack here. But I think that another version of this, by the way, a former roommate of his had said that they believed that Schneider had cut off the fingers while he was in the care of mental health professionals. The injury on his torso had been self-inflicted in some way. So the questions that emerge are, well, first, why would a person do that to themselves? How does that relate to alien underground bases? And what does that all have to do with the idea of this broader ET presence in Dulce? To understand all of that and to really unpack why Schneider ends up kind of being a central figure in all that, we kind of have to go back in time a little. We mentioned Paul Benowitz. He was certainly someone who would have been considered of consequence, I think, in the broader ufological narrative of the early 1980s. Benowitz also seemed to believe that there was a extraterrestrial race that was attempting essentially a takeover, that they were going to try and come to Earth and that they wanted to occupy space here. And I think Paul thought, again, looking at a hero's narrative kind of a thing here, he thought, I'm going to do what I can to prevent that and try to save Earth from there being an imminent takeover. Fundamentally, I think that's what he was trying to do when he went to Kirtland Air Force Base and warned them, I'm detecting some signals. I think there's something going on here. As the story goes, in addition to being encouraged to study UFOs, at least as he was led to believe, that he was detecting around Kirtland Air Force Base, when in fact there were NSA experiments going on there. Some have speculated it may have involved the early Starfire project and some beam transmissions and things that he was detecting. With all of these different components taken into consideration, he was also apparently given a computer at some point that helped him to decode some of these transmissions, and they effectively gave him different terms like planet, water, earthlings, travel, interstellar, and it was all these different kind of random terms, kind of like a random term generator. But for Benowitz, he begins to piece together a narrative that they're from a planet that doesn't have water, and that there is this issue. They've come here, they're coming here, and they may be attempting to take over or to have a secretive presence. Now, what's really interesting, though, is that we have a lot of different people who would make similar claims over the years. For instance, Bob Lazar. Bob Lazar told a story that apparently had been associated with S4, but he said that there had been 44 scientists who were part of a briefing that was being held by a Gray, and that someone had come in. Now, the rule had been don't ever bring firearms into the room. Someone broke the protocol, brings a firearm into the room. The Gray is aware of this, and immediately everyone in the room, all the scientists, are killed, purportedly with a headshot of some kind. To retaliate, some of the base security are sent down there, I think 22 of them in number. They go down, they're all killed also. So 66 people, that number of significance here, end up being killed according to the story as told by Bob Lazar. And we had other stories too. There was a guy who used to call into the old Billy Goodman Happening radio program, a predecessor to Coast to Coast AM. And this guy would call himself Yellow Fruit, an actual code name of an actual project, that has a whole different story. But Yellow Fruit would call in and talk about these underground bases and things like this too, and the idea of reptilian aliens that might persist in some of these. So it's interesting that you see all of these different people. It turns out, by the way, that Yellow Fruit, who called into that program, was probably a guy named Tal Levesque, and he also a weird character who's involved in all of this, and probably the guy who created another character who had, I think Tom Costello had been his name, and he was another proponent that there was this underground base that aliens were occupying and that there'd been some kind of a fight. Best I can tell is Phil Schneider takes kind of this myth building and he begins to tell this story himself. And now the shop injuries, or however he may have lost these fingers, it's, well, I was in the firefight, they were blasted off, and this adds further weight to his story. So it's kind of fascinating because really all the data seems to point, like Katie is saying, it seems to point to the idea that Schneider probably had injured himself. I mean, he had suffered from multiple different injuries. He had chronic pain throughout his life, but he somehow managed to kind of take on an identity that was in the midst of this whole idea of these underground bases somewhere in New Mexico, which for all we know, they very well may exist, but I don't know that Schneider had ever been there.
That becomes the difficult thing with this conversation, because this is not the only case where we hear conjecture about underground bases or alliances or conflict with alien beings, but this particular event, the Battle of Dulce, has so many questionable characters wrapped up into it. That's one of the reasons I wanted to discuss it, because can we separate the potential validity of this case from some of the shadier aspects of the people who are involved in it?
I think it's a very important case for the mere fact that I think it's the beginning of these Black Axis projects that the Air Force, Richard Doty and others had made the decision to decide, and I think it's still happening to this day, where we have our secret technologies and perhaps underground bases and maybe trains running from, NORAD, Colorado Springs, New Mexico. These are all important locations across the country, and they want to steer the narrative of, hey, let's say it's UFOs and aliens. Let's see what people are reporting. That brings in some of these reporting organizations that take these reports, and we know that these are being looked at, and this has been going on for decades now, and I think that was a very important beginning of that.
A real tragedy to me of Benowitz's story is that specifically, he saw craft landing in a weapons facility, and out of concern, genuine concerns for the country and for what he perceived to be happening, he made the mistake of calling the base and saying, here's what I'm seeing, and then that decision was made. We're going to put him in a position, that untenable position really, and it landed him in the hospital.
And Benowitz was a military veteran. He was a patriot. He truly believed he was doing some great service.
That's the tragedy to me, is that he was just doing the right thing as he understood it, and the way it was approached, he became the casualty.
Yeah. And this can take us, both the cases of Schneider and Benowitz, for different reasons, but this can take us into a whole nother discussion about the responsibility of the community and how we handle potential witnesses, potential experiencers, how we assess their stories. You know, I feel it can probably be very easy, not just in the UFO community, but in the unsolved community in general, to take a story and immediately start running with it and citing it as credible. Again, I'm not here to say that any of this is or is not true, but both of these people met fairly tragic ends, you know, and whether or not Mr. Schneider's demise is connected to any of this is something we can continue in our discussion, but at the very least, there is a consequence to wanton speculation coupled with disinformation, you know, and I think the community, maybe I'm wrong, but may play a role in that as well.
My question is, what was the time frame between when Schneider, or when he first came out, between that and when he was murdered? What's the time frame here? What are we looking at? When did he first come out with all this information? How long was he allowed to speak? Or,
I mean, just would have been a few years.
Pretty short period of time. And from what I understand, Mr. Schneider was, and this is another aspect that is debated, and there is conjecture over how he was found, but he was found with a piece of surgical tubing wrapped around his neck several times, which caused him to asphyxiate. Mr. Schneider did have a number of very serious medical issues. He underwent very regular treatment, in-home treatment, from what I understand. I could be mistaken on some of these finer points. And that is one of the reasons that people consider his death to be very, very suspicious, because the argument is that, well, he didn't have the physical capability to strangle himself. I do not know if that is true or not. You know, I'm not a doctor. But that is one of the points of contention here when attempts are made by anyone to debunk his story. It's, well, what about the circumstances of this mysterious death? So one of the rumors that I've heard discussed is that it wasn't actually surgical tubing, it was piano wire.
I think he made it a point to be verbal about, hey, if I'm found dead and they're going to blame it on a suicide, don't believe them. And I think his wife contested that very thing. So he did speak out about that.
I think we could say he laid the groundwork for suspicion in the event that he were found dead. As far as the differences in the actual, what would we call this, cordage, I guess, that was used in the final act. It was, my understanding was that it was medical tubing, a catheter tube, I believe, is effectively what they said it was. There had been further insinuations, though, based on allegations made by a psychic that it had been piano wire. And that seems to have been injected in at a later time. And, again, Norio Hayakawa and others have been very clear about saying, listen, this is an aspect that was introduced and effectively is not backed by evidence. I think Gabe Valdez and others had actually looked at the coroner's report, and sure enough, I mean, the medical tubing is what had been used. And again, in fairness, the coroner's report determined that it was a death by suicide. That's the official story, which, I mean, naturally people will look at a death like that and they'll say, well, that's suspicious. I have to say, I mean, this guy and the kind of claims he was making, that he suddenly ends up dead just a few years after the fact, it does look suspicious. That doesn't necessarily mean that he was killed. But again, those are the facts. So, I mean, it's an interesting situation where we have uncertainty injected into it based on information, in this case the piano wire, and other things, that if you trace that back to its source, you can say, well, that's far less credible probably than the coroner report itself.
And this could be another example, correct me if I'm wrong, Micah, but of misinformation, where these stories are spreading through sincere parties that, they might not necessarily be aware of all the details.
Yeah, whereas interestingly, let's just say that if Schneider, for whatever reason, had decided to kind of appropriate the underground base theory and make it his own by making himself a part of it, that effectively we could call disinformation, but it's not government disinformation. It's just he is intentionally providing information about something that isn't actually true. Now, do I think that there are underground bases? Oh, I sure do. I sure do think our military has a lot of underground bases. I sure think that there's a lot of stuff. I think that there may also be some interesting things happening around the Archuleta Mesa. I think that certainly Paul Benowitz, being a pilot, flew up around there. He saw what appeared to be crash wreckage, which we suspect might have been involved with some early UAV flights by the U.S. military. It was stated later that, and I think Richard Doty said that they put piping in place to make it look like ventilation shafts for underground bases and things. But Gabe Valdez, the legendary police officer who was investigating all this, and he had been interviewing people in the area about their stories about alleged bases, Gabe and his son said that they went up there and they said they weren't like props. I mean, we found actual ventilation shafts. And they thought, and others too, that there really was possibly some kind of underground facility. But again, how better to try and detract the significance of that away than to make the story sound absurd and inject all this false narrative around it. So I mean, arguably what was happening in the 80s and 90s with ufology at that time with certain key players, Paul Benowitz, Linda Moulton Howe, William Moore and others, even extend that to Stanton Friedman and others if you look at the MJ12 documents in that same vein. What was happening around that time is of key significance because we see a pretty good precedent for the injection of disinformation into the UFO narrative, but also the way that people's belief in these things over time continues. And people are still talking about a lot of this, and they still are considered cornerstones of modern ufology.
We talk about some of Schneider's other claims. This blew my mind because Schneider claimed his father was a German U-boat captain captured by the United States and then participated in the Philadelphia experiment, which is a whole other offshoot, but it's the same story, but it's not. I mean, it's a lot to hold together. He didn't tell anybody about that. His father didn't tell anybody about that until like a deathbed confession happened. He also claimed his father was personally acquainted with Valiant Thor.
Yes.
And Schneider even had a photo that he used during his lectures where he said, here's my dad, and this gentleman right here in the foreground, that's Valiant Thor.
Yeah.
Which of all the incredible cases that, I mean, and again, there's much more to say about that, but he latched on to all these classics. And
Well, case in point, he claims at age 14 he was given a piece of the Roswell record.
yeah.
Schneider did. All one person. This is all one person. At the center of these groundbreaking cases. And, I think a little parallel to Lazar, I suppose, that is one of those pieces of information that is, it lends credibility to his story enough to where you give him the benefit of the doubt, is how the drilling took place, how it was conducted. In the tunnels, he claimed that there was a laser of some sort that would essentially liquefy the rock and turn it into sort of a black covered coating, and then the rest would be cored out as the drill went through. And people at the time said, okay, now you're science fiction, but now years later it's come to light, oh yeah, that technology does exist, and that is how many underground tunnels are drilled. So then people would look at that and say, well, gee, if he was right about that, and nobody at the time thought that he was telling the truth, what else should we, shift in our thinking about that? So it all lends itself to this, here's a piece, here's a crumb of something that ends up being true. Therefore, is the rest of what he's saying true? I mean, that's the sort of mental gymnastics that go on when you go into this and enter this realm.
Well, that's the reason we're talking about this case, because it would be pretty easy. I will probably say this several times as we have these conversations. It would be pretty easy to look at the surface level and say, this is what we would call in the modern day fan fiction. This is an invention. This is a story that you dreamed up. But then there are all these little connections, as we've been learning, to other witnesses and other potential cases. So then we have to ask, okay, even if Schneider was fabricating this or imagining it, maybe it was the result of mental illness. I don't have the qualification to comment on that. Might there be nuggets of truth in here that are connections to real things? And we've talked about the possibility of these underground bases. But one of the other claims that he made is that he was aware of 11 individual alien races operating on planet Earth. That may be too big of a question to add into this conversation right now, but 11? How likely is it that there's going to be one? There are 11?
Just watch the Men in Black movies. I mean, there's plenty of alien races that are interacting with us here on Earth.
Here, 2 up to 76 or something. I mean, there's numbers spouted out all the time.
It's almost the sensation of, if you're going to go that far with the story, why not?
Yeah.
You know, you tell the implausible long enough, and all of a, you tell it long enough, and it just becomes sort of acceptable. But yeah, it's staggering, really, the numbers that he would throw out. Just overall, I mean, alien races that he alleged, I think, $500 billion a year, and goes to black projects. I mean, just all these staggering facts and figures on all sorts of things.
Not only did he say that there were 11 races, I mean, he broke down into 7 are good and 4 are evil.
He got very specific.
Very detailed in his description of them.
Very specific. And in audio I've heard of some of his talks, that's when he starts going into the Valiant Thor thing and this alien being that's supposedly operating still on Earth today. But again, that's a topic that we will get to.
On the surface, this sounds maybe like a fictitious story, but it has elements that tie into other possibilities that are clues or little tidbits of crumbs. One of those is out there in Colorado, the San Luis Valley, the Elbert County, the Rocky Mountain Ranch, where you're hearing bangs and hums and sounds underground. Potentially could be tunneling. So that's where it gets, for me, like you have to pick this apart very carefully because there could be something to those claims.
Yeah. Well, and do any of us really think there is not some kind of a nuclear bunker under the Pentagon, for example? Like, of course these facilities exist, but how many and where? And are there aliens?
Yeah, 11.
The other thing too is, I mean, like, good disinformation requires on there being some valid evidence, or rather I should say some truths blended with some fictions. If there isn't some truth in there, you won't sell the fiction. In order for it to be successful, in other words, there have to be some believable elements, because I think it's a natural human tendency, and this is kind of like what you were saying earlier, it's like, if this sounds true and this later came to pass as being authentic, then does that verify everything that this person said? Disinformation works in a similar way. We put 1 or 2 things that are true and the rest is false, but if people can use those truths as anchor points, well, I can't rule that out. It could all be true. I mean, this is proven, so.
Right. Yes.
And so in essence, the disinformation effort would be like this. Yes, there are underground bases. Some may be in this location, and there may be some truths to some of the stories about them, but we pepper in a bunch of really crazy stuff, right? And effectively, it really just helps to detract away from the validity of the things we're trying to hide.
When talking about stories with seeds of truth in them, in our first conversation, we talked about the rumor of President Eisenhower meeting with and striking a deal with alien races. And one of the things that Schneider alleged is that the establishment of these bases was a result of that treaty that Eisenhower put together with these extraterrestrial beings. And of course, as we've already learned, that's another story that may have little seeds of truth to it. Probably did go in for some kind of a procedure that night, President Eisenhower, but did he actually meet with alien beings? So it's interesting, like you said a moment ago, Katie, the way these cases intersect and we find these commonalities that on the surface have no reason to be there, and yet there they are.
Right, and this is the time too, from 75 to 78, 79 with Linda Moulton Howe in that whole area, the Midwest. So, Colorado, New Mexico, Wyoming, Montana, Oklahoma even. We had the rash of mutilations going on at that time, and is that connected to these rumors at the Dulce base as well? Not just cattle, but horse, sheep, everything like that. And the abduction phenomenon with Travis Walton in 75. So it's a very interesting time, and they all kind of intercept, these different cases. And there are probably tidbits of truth overlaid with something else.
Yeah.
I have that his wife, I don't know if it was his wife or ex-wife that at the time after he'd passed away, I'm not sure, but when she went back to his place after he had passed away, all of this documents relating to all of this, everything was missing. All valuables were still there, but any of the documents, lecture material, things like that were all gone, which just adds a shade of odd.
Yeah, and to dovetail on that, I've seen it alleged that many of his public lectures have been scrubbed from the internet. They're harder and harder to find. I was able to find a snippet, and I'm no crackerjack researcher. They're out there on YouTube still. But that seems to be in the comments section and elsewhere. There's the assumption that his things are starting to disappear from the internet in general. Which is interesting too, because on the lecture that I saw from him, the most compelling thing I thought that he said was towards the end of his lecture is a quote, "Public officials must tell us the truth. If not, they must be removed, or else what's the point of freedom?" And whatever else his motivation was or where his story came from, I think for him to say something like that appeals to most Americans who want there to really be freedom, who have a sense that we're not being told the truth on everything. And so whether or not Phil Schneider invented his story out of thin air, or if it was truthful, that resonates with viewers and with people sitting there listening to him. And it's hard to sit there and say, no, I believe everything the government says, everything's fine. So that ad, and then he ends up dead under mysterious circumstances, just adds fuel to the fire.
Mm-hmm. It's very much an iconic case when we're talking about some of these specific themes. It's difficult to summarize. It's really difficult to wrap.
Yeah.
Yes.
He's almost like Forrest Gump. He's in all these great moments in UFO history,
Did we want to talk about how, if there's any truth to his story, that and there was this battle, then back to Eisenhower, if there was a deal made, this somehow has to be maintained, and it's not always friendly, and this might not be a good narrative, and maybe that's what the truth is, that we are somehow food or containers, or they want our souls. There's a dark side to this as well, and I know the narrative out there right now is love and light, and they're all good and have our backs, but maybe the truth is not such good news for us.
Yeah. No, I think that's important, both in terms of logistics. What does this actually mean if there is an underground base of aliens that we have lost control of?
Right.
But then also you mentioned that it's a dark narrative. This whole saga really is pretty dark, both from the alleged things that may be going on in the desert to the impact it has had on the people associated with it. It unfortunately strikes a very dark contrast with some of these other cases that we'll talk about that are a little more fun and maybe a little bit more lighthearted.
Yeah, but I'm not sure how afraid I'm going to be of an alien that could take a couple of direct hits and just lose a couple fingers and have some scars on my chest. You know what I mean? That seems a little hokey to me. Yet they were able to take out all these other people as well, so yeah.
Yeah.
What's almost suggested by it is that the problem is contained, right? Because if they're super aliens with plasma weapons,
Right.
You'd think we would have no chance against that they would be out by now causing havoc.
Mm-hmm.
So either we've got it contained and everything's fine, with our guns were enough to take them all out.
That's right.
Or there's some other situation that we have no idea about. But it just struck me in what we were talking about as well. If it is true, and we were talking was this the episode where we were talking about archetypes? Yeah. Well, it's unclear to me in the original telling of the story where those aliens came from in the first place, because it sounds like we poked a hole into some area where the aliens were already. But it's never really stated, was that a base in itself, or was that just a cave? When you talk about archetypes, it sounds like you're drilling into the pits of hell and releasing the demons, and they're all coming out, and it's up to us to stop them.
Right. How were they described? Were they reptilian? Is they so
like lizard-like.
Yeah, so you have the whole idea about the serpent in the garden and all that stuff. Oh, absolutely. I think that all comes into play as well, too, yeah.
In that area, too, with the Native American, the Ute, Cheyenne, Navajo, Comanche, Pawnee, all that, we have the ant people folklore, So in the Great Sand Dunes, they have that different type of glass. I don't know how the sand dunes in Colorado got there. Ant people, I don't know. So were they just there naturally and they just drilled into it and whoop, there they are, surprise.
Right. Yeah.
Here we are.
A lot of cultures like ants and snakes and things like that, they're chthonic figures, right? They're of the earth, which means they have some sort of precedent over that land itself. So maybe within that tale that we are now the interlopers. Maybe they were there first and somehow we intruded on their land.
Whether or not Phil Schneider was telling the truth or even believed he was telling the truth, it's become evident that the story of the Battle of Dulce is an interesting study in the ways that folklore and stories and narratives intersect within the UFO community. And if nothing else, it's a study in the way in which these stories affect the human beings associated with them.